suddenly we were surrounded by soldiers. To be marched anywhere with an automatic rifle in your back is bad enough, but when the soldiers are absolutely stoned out of their mind, as these guys were, anything could happen. And they said to us, "Where are you going?" We said, "We want to visit Father George Culture. We want to pray with him." No way that was going to happen. And they marched us to the end of the street. They were just about to put us in their car, and suddenly everybody disappeared and we were left standing on the street. Suddenly we were free. I don't know what happened, but I know God had something to do with it.
Welcome, everybody. This is Simon Gilbo with Inspired. Inspired, if you're new to us, is all about hearing great stories from people that have had super interesting, inspiring lives. I am sick to death of the relentless bombardment we get through the media of bad news. If you follow the news too closely, you're just letting someone else curate all the bad stuff to make you more depressed, more cynical, more anxious, and we don't need that. What we need is to hear good news that stirs us in our faith and gives us a skip in our stride, which I've got no doubt you'll have in an hour's time once we've finished with the wonderful Merv Thomas. Welcome, Merv.
Hi, Simon. Great to be with you.
Yeah, brilliant to have you, mate. So, funny enough, Merv and I were together in London yesterday. The last few days at a conference. Over the years, we've been at loads of overlapping conferences, both speaking to different crowds. He is a governor of Monkton Combe, which is where two of my kids are here in Bath. And I think most importantly, in terms of what we'll be discussing, he's the founder of CSW, Christian Solidarity Worldwide, and has had a beautiful impact in the lives of many, many people. And I'll plug it from the get-go. I've got your book here, Merv, Standing Up and Speaking Out, which is a good read, and because I've read it, I'm going to have to fake it that I don't know anything about your background. So, but go on, fill us in. How was your childhood?
Well, my childhood. Well, I was born in Essex. I'm an Essex boy, and grew up in a pretty strict Pentecostal home. Way back in the 50s, Pentecostal churches were probably much stricter than they are today. There are lots of rules. I was never allowed to play football in the garden, for example, on a Sunday. My mum and dad hadn't got a car, and so we walked to church because we couldn't get, although we could have got a bus, but we weren't allowed to make the bus driver work on a Sunday because it was the Sabbath. So no TV, no new Sunday newspapers, and we would walk 3 miles to church Sunday morning. We'd walk 3 miles home. We'd walk 3 miles to Sunday school in the afternoon and 3 miles home. And we'd walk 3 miles to church in the evening and 3 miles home. And that was my life growing up.
18 miles.
Very, very strict. But it was fantastic. It was, I don't have any regrets for those times. They were times when, I gave my heart to Jesus when I was 8 years old. I was baptized in water when I was 9, filled with the Holy Spirit, speaking in tongues when I was 12, and I look back to some fantastic. What I think probably was a real spiritual grounding for me was that we used to have young people's prayer meetings. The only older person there was the pastor in a little back room in the church, and we used to be on our knees, kneeling and praying in tongues, more tongues than English, but they were real powerhouses, and I really remember those with great fondness. And but of course, I guess as lots of people, as I grew older, there were times when I wasn't as close to the Lord as others, but I never lost my faith.
Did you ever rebel, sort of kick against the goads?
Yeah, not really. No, I probably would have rebelled if it hadn't been for my dad. My dad was an elder in the church, and he was a real man of God. And I really have got him to thank for this, because he was. Some people can be one thing in church and another thing at home, can't they? But my dad acted out his faith in the home as well as in the pulpit, and I was very grateful for that. And I think the reason I never openly rebelled was because, out of respect for my dad more than anything else, I would have hated to have disappointed him. But in my early 20s, in the early 70s, I decided I thought it was important that Christians got involved in politics. Now, this was really something that evangelicals and certainly Pentecostals never did in those days. It just didn't happen. I have to say my dad was very supportive, but the church weren't particularly supportive because, and wait for it, Simon, but because I couldn't go to the prayer meeting on a Wednesday night because I had council meetings. And, they didn't see, people didn't see, it all revolved around the church. And preaching the gospel was not about going out and being salt and light in the community. It was about knocking on people's doors and having open air services on a Sunday afternoon. In fact, I remember writing an article in the Assemblies of God magazine called Redemption Tidings. I wrote the article and it said, we need Pentecostal politicians. And I didn't get a particularly favourable postbag. People thought it was a dirty business, and politics very often was and is a dirty business. But that's exactly why we need to be there.
Yeah.
Thankfully, that's changed now.
Yeah.
But I got elected to my local council, Thurrock Borough Council, in 1977 when I was 24 years old. And that was the beginning of a life that has very much been not centred around politics, but politics has been very much a part of my life since that time. And it was really, I felt it was really important that we had those Christian voices. And in fact, when I think back, it was probably people like Lyndon Bowring and Charlie Colchester at CARE that really broke that mould, who joined with people like Mary Whitehouse. But they were the first evangelical voices that were really heard in the public square. And that's a shame, because I think we let other groups like the LGBTQ lobby, for example, who really were good being active in the public square. And in fact, very often Christians lament some of the legislation that's been passed over the years. Well, maybe it wouldn't have been passed if Christians had been more actively involved. But that was my younger life, and it was through my involvement in the political world, in the Conservative Party, which I was a member of, that I first heard about persecuted Christians and got involved when setting up CSW. I used to go up to Parliament a couple of nights a week, and I did a bit of work for a Catholic MP called David Atkinson. He was the MP for Bournemouth East. And I used to go up and just do a little bit of research for him. And one day he said to me he'd heard about an organisation that had been set up in Switzerland called Christian Solidarity International. It was supporting Christians being persecuted in Russia and Romania, the old Eastern Bloc countries. And he said to me, he knew I was a Christian. He said, well, perhaps we should start something in this country. And to be honest with you, Simon, I wasn't that enthusiastic. I knew nothing about the persecuted church, and I only said yes to him because, well, kind of out of kindness to him. If he wanted to start something like this, I'd do it too. So my entry into this world and setting up of what is now CSW was done rather reluctantly, to be honest with you. But I thought it was important that we provide a voice. CSW is not an aid organisation, although we do little bits, but we're a voice for those unable to speak for themselves, as it tells us to be in Proverbs 31. Yeah. But I did, even though I said reluctantly I would do this, and I became the first board chair, I felt the Lord show me or tell me that, and I'm not somebody who hears God's voice every 5 minutes, but I did felt Lord clearly show me that we didn't use the word advocacy much in those days, but this was began to become something like the Christian version of Amnesty International. Right. But God did also show me that this was going to be my life's work, that I was going to be at the centre of this. And so that was the beginning of doing what I'm doing now.
From age 27, and it was you, Catholic MP, an Orange Order Protestant MP, was it?
Yes, yeah. When I look back, it's quite funny. Yeah, there weren't there were very few MPs that were interested in this. So the first three of us that started this, it was myself, Pentecostal, of course, this Catholic MP, and the second MP that joined us was a guy called the Reverend Martin Smith, who at the time was the president of the world, or Grand Master of the World Orange Order. He was an Ulster Union, old-style Ulster Unionist MP, fire and brimstone. But, you know, well, as you can guess, we never discussed theology, otherwise CSW wouldn't be in existence today. But we were united in wanting to speak out for what was happening to our family around the world. And so that's how we started. And when, when I look back over the years, I mean, today, Simon, in Parliament, there's over 150 members of the all-party parliamentary group for freedom of religion or belief. In those days, there was the three of us. There was David Atkinson and Martin Smith. Then David Alton, a young David Alton, had just got into Parliament. And the other person that joined us very early on was the late David Amis, who, of course, was assassinated just a few years ago. David was a dear friend. I took him to Russia in 1987. But apart from those, there was very little interest. But I thank God that, things have changed now.
Yeah. A few years ago, I took my kids on a 2-month drive through Eastern Europe, through Poland and Slovakia and Macedonia, Albania, Romania, all these countries, Hungary. And it gave me a fresh, healthy hatred of what communism does. We met people who had suffered so much for the atheists, perspective and the persecution of believers. Now, I love reading your book, your first trip to Romania. Go on, paint a picture of what it was like. And you went with the footballer Justin Fashanu, didn't you?
I did. I went with the footballer Justin Fashanu, and I went with 3 American congressmen. And this was for all of us, all 4 of us, or 5 of us, this was the first time we travelled to a country where there was persecution. And the picture of Romania in those days, Simon, actually was very similar to North Korea today. The main difference was that Romania didn't have nuclear weapons. But Nicolae Ceausescu, who was the dictator and the president of Romania, was akin very much to Kim Jong-un today. I mean, 1 in 4 people, 25% of the population of Romania were informers to the Securitate, the secret police. You couldn't move without the Securitate watching you, whatever you were doing, and they hated Christians. I don't know why, but communists tend to dislike organised religion and people of faith. Part of it maybe is because they can often gather large numbers of people in their churches, and they think that there might be a political agenda. But nevertheless, I went there, and the reason we went with 3 American congressmen was that at the time, America was about to vote on whether Romania got what they called special trading status, most favoured nation trading status, it was called. And so these 3 congressmen had made it very clear they were not going to vote for most favoured nation trading status because of the lack of religious freedom. So Romania said to them, "Oh, come and we'll show you that we're free." And what happened was I got there 2 days before the congressman, and this was totally my fault. I totally messed the dates up. And so Justin Fashanu, I'd never met Justin before. At the time, he was a very famous footballer. He was the first £1 million black player in the UK, had just come to faith. And so we travelled there together. And so we'd got a couple of days before the American congressman arrived. We thought we'd better visit the British embassy just to tell them we were in the country. And our reception in the British embassy was not, they weren't that welcoming. They took us down into this concrete bunker. They said it was the only place that they could speak, without being overheard, and basically said to us, "You two need to go home. You know, you shouldn't be here. You're going to be arrested. You're going to be kicked out, and it's not good for you to be here." Well, we said, "Well, we're here. We're going to be part of this delegation with the congressman," but they kept telling us to go home and we said, "No, we're not going to go home." They said, "Well, just keep your head down for a couple of days till the congressman get here." And I'm afraid we did the opposite. We went back to our hotel room. We had a fantastic time of prayer, and we felt the Lord was telling us to go and visit a man called Father George Calchu. Now, Father Calchu had spent 21 years of his life in prison. He was an Orthodox priest, but was an amazing evangelist. And funnily enough, David Alton, a few weeks before we'd gone there, he had he'd been on a visit to Romania, and he'd got this guy released from prison, Father Calchu. But we were pretty sure he was under house arrest. So Justin and I decided that we were going to go and visit Father Calchu in his flat. And, the apartment blocks in communist countries, in communist Romania in those days, were pretty awful places. They were like rabbit warrens. And I think we had a gate, we had a street name, and then we had a gate number, a door number, a floor number. And fashion, I thought, well, we don't even know where this place is. What are we going to do? And as we were walking along the street, we saw this little door, and it said Anglican Church of the Resurrection. So we thought, wow, well, let's knock on this door. And an American priest called Father Keefers came to the door, and we told him who we were, and in fact, he didn't even want to invite us in. He was frightened, and he said, "Well, what do you want?" We said, "Well, we want to visit Father George Calchu. Do you know of him?" And the guy went completely white, and he said, "Yes, everybody knows him." He said, but you won't be able to get near him. You'll be arrested." So we said, "Well, do you know where he lives?" "Yes, I do." "Could you take us there?" And he said, "Well, no, it's too dangerous. I can't take you." And in any case, I've got a wedding this afternoon. So we said, "Right, we're coming back when your wedding's finished, and you can take us." And very, very reluctantly, he dropped us off a couple of streets away. He was so frightened. And we boldly marched down this. We found the gate number and the street name and all of this stuff. We marched down, and we didn't have to know what flat it was, because as we got close to it, suddenly we were surrounded by soldiers with automatic rifles. And these guys marched us up the street, out of the street. And if you've ever been, I think it's probably one of the most frightening moments of my life, because to be marched anywhere with an automatic rifle in your back is bad enough. But when the soldiers are absolutely stoned out of their mind, as these guys were, totally drunk, anything could happen. And they marched us to the end of the street. By the time we got to the end of the street, we were surrounded by all these cars. Suddenly drew up, surrounded with guys getting out of cars, and these were Securitati people. And they said to us, what are you doing? Where are you going? We said we want to visit Father George Calchu. Is part of our family. Is a family member. And they said, "Why do you want to visit him?" We said, "Well, we want to pray with him." And they were saying, "No way that was going to happen." And what I remember was Justin had, and these were new in those days, he had a brand new Sony Walkman. And do you remember those at all?
Yeah.
And it got music playing in it from the Nottingham Christian Centre, and so he let some of these guys listen to it, and he said, "If you let us go and pray, I'll give you this to you." But they would have none of it, and they were just about to put us in their car, and suddenly everybody disappeared. And we were left standing on the street by ourselves. I don't know what happened, but I know God had something to do with it. And suddenly we were free. when we got back to our hotel, we were told, "Oh, they've got a better room for us." They wanted, our room wasn't very comfortable, so they wanted a room clearly that could be much more. We could have much more surveillance. But anyway, we were told we were going to be sent home. The American congressman arrived the next day and said that, cut a long story short, to say, if you send these guys home, we're going home too. And they really didn't want them to go home, so we were all allowed to stay. And actually, looking back on it, Simon, the amazing thing is to all intents and purposes, that was kind of the beginning of the religious freedom movement we've got in the world today. Because one of those Congressman Frank Wolf, went back and he wrote the International Religious Freedom Act, which was the beginning of all of the religious freedom movement of today. So you can see God's hand in it. But it was quite a hairy trip, but we met some amazing people. And Father Calchu became one of my dearest friends and a real spiritual father and mentor to me, which was kind of unusual, coming from a Pentecostal background, to have a Romanian Orthodox priest who was a spiritual father, but he really was a wonderful man.
Wonderful. And that trip was like a light bulb moment for you, wasn't it, on your journey?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, it was, without any shadow of doubt, because all that I'd read about persecution, I suddenly saw. All that, and it wasn't until a couple of years later when they actually let Father Calchu free, and he told us that our attempt to visit him had been one of the reasons they'd allowed him to go, because they'd been pretending that he wasn't under house arrest, and we'd found out for ourselves. So it was a light bulb moment. It was and for the first time, names on a piece of paper became real people to me. They became friends. They became heroes, and many of those people are still friends to me today.
Yeah. Now, I know again from reading the book, but part of the journey of faith is being out of your comfort zone and not knowing where the money's going to come from, isn't it? Can you share some stories of God's provision and breakthroughs?
Yeah, I can, Simon. I wouldn't even know where to start. So much of it's in the early days when we started up. I remember one particular instance. We'd employed a national. I was chairman of the board, so I wasn't working for the organisation, but we'd employed a national director, and I was travelling up and down the country every Sunday speaking at churches. I'd go up north for a morning meeting and drive back home and speak in London in the evening. And money was hard. When you start a charity, it's hard to get people to support you because they don't know who you are. And I remember one particular month, I used to keep the checkbook. I was a signatory on the checkbook, and our national director, as he was called in those days, he had no idea how much was in the bank account. I knew, and I also knew that his salary was due on a particular date, and we hadn't got the money in the bank account. And we were by then doing a newsletter that went out regularly to the few hundred supporters that we got. That was all. But I remember writing the check out for the amount, knowing that, first of all, we hadn't got an overdraft. The bank would never let us have an overdraft. And I remember writing the check out and thinking, this is going to bounce, but I'm going to give it to him in faith. And I drove down. Our offices were in Southend-on-Sea, and I drove down from Grays, where I lived, and put the check in an envelope, and I handed it over to him. I didn't say anything, and he said to me, "Oh, Merv, you'll never guess what's happened this morning." So I said, "What's that?" He said, "I've had a letter with a check in it. And the letter is from two young supporters who have been recently married. They've been saving up for the past couple of years to buy themselves a suite of furniture. And they've just read our magazine, and they said that the persecuted Christians in Romania need their money more than they need a new suite of furniture." And they drew out their whole savings, and it was to the pound the amount of money that I'd written that check out for.
Fabulous.
And amazing. God always turns up on time.
Yeah.
We always think it's a bit late. He certainly leaves it to the last minute sometimes. But, and there have been other stories. I remember later on when we had our national director, then another national director, he had a company car. And he needed it because he was travelling all around the country. And he phoned me up one day. I was still the chairman, and I was working in Cambridgeshire. And he phoned me up. And Mervyn said, I've been to London today, and when I've come back to the station, our offices by then were in Witney in Oxfordshire. He said, by the time I come back to the station, the car has been stolen. I don't know what I'm going to do. So I said, well, hire a car tonight, because he was living in Widnes, so he was travelling home every weekend. And but he said, God keeps putting on my mind, he said, that a man, and I can't remember his name. All I know is a Ford car dealer somewhere in East Anglia. So I said, oh, right, okay. So he said, but I feel God's telling me to contact him. So anyway, I said, well, okay, but what, do you know his name or the town? No, I know nothing, he said, but I'm going to phone up the Ford dealer in Cambridge. So he phones up, and apparently the conversation goes something like this. When the girl answered the phone, he said, does the owner of your garage always talk about Jesus? And the girl said, oh, yeah, that's our Paul. He's always... So he said, oh, I need to speak to him. Anyway, the long story short was he put a car on a low loader and sent it down to Witney straight away and let us have that for as long as we needed it, and then got us a new car later on. And that again was God. But let me tell you an amazing story about my son. This was God providing that. So Seth, my son at the time, he, as you know, Simon, went to Monkton Combe, just down the road from you. But when I guess he was probably 7 or 8, and he used to come and listen to me speak in churches about the persecuted church and so forth. And he'd been saving up for a long while for a FIFA video game. Okay.
Yep.
And he, one Sunday evening, he said, Dad, can we empty my money box to see how much I've got in there? Pound coins they were. And so we emptied it, and I think he needed something like £48 to get this thing. So we counted out the money, and there was £50 in his money box. So I said, great, Seth, you've got enough for your video game. He said, Dad, I think the persecuted church needs my money more than I need a video game.
Seth.
This boy was 7 or 8 years old, maybe 9. And I'm thinking, listen, I can't rob my son's money box to keep the ministry going. That really is not odd. So I said, well, Seth, I think you probably need to pray about that. And, well, Dad, he said, I said, perhaps give some of it. You've got £50 in there. You only need £48 for the game. Give a couple of pounds to CSW. He went away, and he said he prayed about it, and a couple of days later, Dad, no, I feel that he said, I'll give the £50, all of it, to CSW. So I said, well, are you really sure? Yes, Dad, I want it. So we counted out these pound coins, £50, put them in a bag. I took them into work the next day, and I took them into my office, and then I said to our finance director, I've got 50. My son wants to give you £50 from his money box. And our finance director was a Nigerian, and he thought this was so incredible, and he prayed, Lord, give this boy a double portion, and he was so excited. And so I said, I'll bring the money down to you. I was on the first floor, he was on the ground floor. So I counted the money out again before I took it down. I said, there's the £50. Later on in the afternoon, he phoned me up from downstairs. He said, Merv, he said, how much did you say Seth wanted to give to CSW? So I said, well, £50. So he said, well, shall I bring the other £50 up then? So I said, pardon? So he said, well, there was £100 in that envelope. So I said, well, I counted it several times. There was 50. No, he said, there was £100 in the envelope. I'll bring you the £50 back you can give to Seth.
Wow.
And he got his video game, and he gave CSW £50, Simon. I did
Love
tell
that.
him that doesn't happen every time.
Wonderful.
Isn't that incredible?
So faith building, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, good stuff. Well, you, like me, have been in some very dangerous places. We talked a bit about Romania. I don't know if you want to share more on that, but Iraq, Nigeria. You're still around by the grace of God. Tell us a few of those stories.
Yeah, I guess, actually, Simon, the most dangerous place that I've been to Iraq and Syria and places like that, Lebanon, the Middle East. But I do think that probably the most dangerous place that I travelled to is Nigeria. Northern Nigeria is so lawless, but it's been amazing to see. So Nigeria, for those people who don't know, Nigeria basically is half Christian and half Muslim. Most of the Christians live in the south, and most of the Muslims live in the north. But there's a vibrant church in the north and in the central belt. And over the last years, several terrorist groups and organisations have been operating in the north. Boko Haram, which is based right in the far northeast of the country in a place called Maiduguri. And then there's the Fulani militia, who are Fulani herdsmen who are armed and killing Christians. And then there's the Islamic State, West Africa province. Very dangerous place. You can't travel, particularly in the north. It's lawless, and you'll be stopped every few miles by groups of people with fully armed, and you don't know whether they are soldiers, whether they're police, whether they're terrorists, or whether they are just bandits, because they're all usually all dressed as if they're in the army. So it's a pretty dangerous place to go. But I first went to Maiduguri. I went right out to as far as you can go, and I don't think I've ever been so frightened travelling in a car than I was on that trip. But God completely undertook. We had a huge car crash on the way. Actually, had a driver that liked to drive at between 90 and 110 miles an hour, with a phone in one hand and a bottle of Coke in the other. And roads in northern Nigeria, are not the smoothest of places, shall we say. We hit a pothole at one point and careered off into the bush. And I seriously thought my life had come to an end. But as we eventually stopped, the CD player in the car was still running, and it was a choir singing "Jesus saves, Jesus saves," and he really did.
Yeah.
But when we got to Maiduguri, I met a guy who had the most amazing story, Pastor Augustine. And, my life has been made up with meeting these heroes of the faith, Simon. And that's what people often say, what keeps you going, is meeting these people who are truly heroes of the faith. And Pastor Augustine told me, because they've been rioting Muslims have been attacking Christians for quite a few months in Maiduguri, because Boko Haram were headquartered there. And he told me that this pastor told me this incredible story where the Muslims had come, the terrorists had come down his street, and they were basically dragging people out and killing them. And his wife and children had moved away a few weeks before to stay with relatives in another part of Nigeria, because they knew that trouble was brewing. And Pastor Augustine told me this incredible story where he was actually sitting in his living room, where this group of armed terrorists broke into his home. He'd heard them dragging people out of other homes and killing them. And he sat in his chair and he said, "Lord, you need to protect me." And they came into the room and they simply didn't see him. It was a small room. I was in the same room when I was talking to him. It was a small room. He was sitting in the chair. He said they looked around, they ransacked the place, and they said, "There's no one here. Let's go upstairs." And they went upstairs. Of course, there was no one there, and they failed to see him. And then Three things happened all on the same day. Then later on, he thought he would go and walk to his church to see if his church was safe. And as he was walking down one particular street, a mob came upon him and surrounded him. And he was dressed rather stupidly in a way. He was dressed in his dog collar, and he was clearly a Christian priest. And these guys surrounded him, and the guy in front of him pulled a huge knife from him and held it up to stab him. And as he did so, his arm was paralyzed. The guy's arm was literally physically paralyzed. Wow. And he couldn't, he just dropped the knife and everybody ran away. And then he got to his church. So twice in that day, God had miraculously saved him. One by paralyzing someone and one by blinding the people in his room. Then he went to his church and it was safe. It hadn't been ransacked. And as he was in the sanctuary, on his knees actually praying and thanking God for saving him and the church, a third mob came into his church and again surrounded him. And this time he said suddenly that one of this mob was an absolutely huge man. And he stood in front of all the others and he said, if you're going to kill this man of God, you need to kill me first. And everybody ran away. And when he turned around to thank the man wasn't there. Clearly an angel. And so amazing stories like that, Simon, and incredible heroes of the faith. And I'll tell you another story actually about New Romania, but that also concerns my son again. He'd always wanted to come on a trip with me. And when he was at Moncton, actually, when he was 17, half term happened to coincide with a trip that I was going to do to Nigeria. And he said, Dad, can I come on that trip? I said, well, I'm not sure about Nigeria. It is pretty dangerous, Seth. And in fact, 2 weeks before that, I'd been in Iraq with my old friend, Congressman Frank Wolf. And Frank had said to me, I said, I'm taking Seth to Nigeria. He said, please, Merv, don't take him to Nigeria. It's the most dangerous place I travel to. I said, I know, Frank, but he really wants to come. So I came home from this trip to Iraq determined to tell Seth he couldn't go to Nigeria with me. And I started to tell him, he said, Dad, don't tell me. He said, the Lord's been telling me, he's given me all kinds of verses about being courageous. So he said, I'm going. And so his mum really didn't want him to go, as you can imagine, Simon. It's funny, she never minds me going to these places. But anyway, that's another story. She really didn't want her boy going there. And but he was 17. We went there and we did a visit to a place that really we hadn't planned to go to, but it was a village we'd heard about that had been attacked by the Fulani militia, and 30 people had been slaughtered in the village. So we went there, and it was along a pretty dangerous road, but we went there just to show solidarity and say, and pray with them. When we got there, we sort of met in the village hall. And they brought in a young boy of 15, so a couple of years younger than Seth, and he'd got a bullet in his leg, and it'd been in his leg for 3 months. It was totally septic. It was gangrenous. It was horrible. And anyway, that had quite an impact in Seth. As we were driving out of the village, and you've got to remember too that the Fulani were camped all around this village. The militia were there. They weren't allowing these guys to farm their fields, because so they were beginning to starve because they couldn't go and farm because they were hiding in the fields around the village. And Seth said a couple of things. First of all, he said as we were driving out, Dad, did you notice? He said, though those people were being killed, he said, and although they're beginning to starve because they've not got any food, he said they all had joy in their hearts. He said, when you prayed with them, he said, I was watching their faces. He said, they've got real joy. And he said, we go to our churches in the UK, he said, and people have got everything. Nobody's dying or being killed there. And there are a load of miserable people in our churches. And I kind of understood what he was saying. But the other thing he said to the guy that was taking us there, who was the leader of a large denomination, he said, why did that 15-year-old boy, why couldn't he have had the bullet removed? And why did he have to have it there for 3 months? So they said, well, there are no hospitals for many miles around. And even if it had got there, he wouldn't have been able to afford treatment. So I said, well, why don't you build a hospital here? And so the guy said, well, if somebody could raise the funds, he said, our denomination would run the hospital. So I could see where this was going, Simon, and I'm trying to stop Seth saying it. And he said, well, how much would it cost? So the guy said, probably about £50,000. So I said, okay, I'll raise it. And I'm saying, his dad's sitting in the back there saying, Seth, there's no way. You've got no idea the value of 50,000. You could not raise 50. No, he said, I know I couldn't, Dad, but God can provide it. So, cut a long story short, the first thing he did was go back to Moncton Combe on the Sunday night, on the day after half term, and he emailed the headmaster, Chris Wheeler, and he said, I want to see you in your study first thing Monday morning.
Classic.
And to Chris's credit, he did. And he said, can we make this our charity of the year? And to Chris's credit, the school actually voted on who their charity was every year. They voted for Seth Show, even though he hadn't even got a charity. He said, could we put it through CSW? Anyway, cut a very long story short, he raised the £50,000 in less than a year. Incredible provision. And went back a year later, and they made him a Nigerian chief when he opened the hospital. But that was an amazing story, again, of God's incredible provision for people who have got joy in their hearts, Simon. And this is what I notice whenever I go and visit people, even though they're so often persecuted, they've got real joy. They're prepared to live and die for their faith.
Yeah, it's so humbling, isn't it, hanging out with them? And I've got lots of my brothers and sisters in Burundi right now going through a hell of a time.
I'm sure.
It's very humbling, very moving. So, folks, I am so excited to tell you about the new Inspired book. Basically, we've done about 200 episodes now, packed with mind-blowing stories. And so we approached by the fantastic publisher 10 of those to get some of them down on paper. So we've taken the stories of 8 former guests, each one very different, but connected by one thing, that they're being used beautifully by God to share the gospel of hope around the world. That could be in the jungles of Brazil or the mountains of Cambodia or in the slums of Uganda. You know, I don't know about you, but I grew up on some of the old classic missionary stories. Could be Chasing the Dragon or God's Smuggler or The Cross and the Switchblade. And my hope is that this book will be a similar inspiration to a new generation. I genuinely think, teenagers like my kids would find it really engaging. These are modern day stories of the unsung heroes of the faith. So if you want to pre-order, you can go to greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired book to grab one copy or multiple copies to pass it around. That's greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired book. I'm really excited. Bring it on, and all the proceeds will go to our ministry, which is helping the poorest of the poor. It's a privilege to be able to share these stories. And on that note, let's get back to the podcast. So a key part of CSW's work is advocacy, and be that for Romania's already touched on, or Egypt, or Russia, North Korea. Take it away. What have you been up to?
Well, I often go. So advocacy, of course, can be two things. It can be shouting things from the rooftops and shaming and blaming governments, or it can be behind closed doors advocacy. And one of the trips that I particularly think of in Egypt, in Egypt, of course, has got the largest Christian minority in the Middle East. We went to visit Egypt soon. I went with some parliamentarians from the UK, and we went there just after President Morsi, who was the first elected president of Egypt, who was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah.
And that had ended in a coup, really, that had been performed by the army, led by the man at the time was General Sisi. And but we went there, and General Sisi had said that even though he'd taken over in a coup, it was because the people had wanted that, and clearly they had wanted it. They were out in masses on the streets. But he said that they would have an election. And we went to see General Sisi. In fact, the day before we went to see him, he'd been promoted to Field Marshal, so he's Field Marshal Sisi. And we didn't think we'd get a meeting with him, but we did. And what was supposed to be a 15-minute meeting turned out into a nearly 3-hour meeting.
Wow.
And Sisi was seemed to me to be a very genuine man, and I questioned him quite strongly on religious freedom, and he talked about it because it was not known at that time whether he was going to stand to be president or not, and he said to me that he believed totally in equality of citizenships for everybody, no matter what their religion. But he said, and if I did stand to be president and became president, I would model that from the top. But it also needs to be modelled from the bottom up. And he was absolutely right, of course. And subsequently, he has modelled that from the top. I'm not pretending everything's good in Egypt, but certainly for Christians, things are better than they ever have been. Yeah. But anyway, as we were coming out of that meeting, he insisted, this is the chief of the defence staff, he insisted on walking us back down the stairs to our cars. And I found myself walking beside him. And I remember it so clearly, I put my arm around him. And I said, Field Marshal, I just want you to know that if you become president of this country, I will pray for you. And I'll pray for you daily. And he stopped and he looked at me. Incidentally, he'd only been speaking in Arabic in the meeting, which was being translated, of course, but I knew he could speak English. And he looked at me and he said, "Do you mean that?" So I said, "Yes, I do." So he said, because, and these are the words he used, he said, "Honest to God," he said, "I don't want to be president of this country." Who would want to be president of this inferno, he said. But if the people want me, I'll do it, but I can only do it if God helps me. And he looked at me and said something then which I didn't agree with, but we all serve the same God. And but he was insistent that he needed God's help. And in fact, when I got into my car, he came across to me and he said in the car, and he said, "You won't forget the promise you just made me, will you?" And I've kept that promise, and I pray for him. And I met him later on when he was president. So it's encounters like those too, that are God encounters. Yeah. I don't know why I even put my arm around him and said I would pray for him, but it came to me in the moment. And people like that need us to be praying for. We're encouraged and exhorted to pray for those in authority over us, aren't we?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was an interesting moment, and a moment that whenever I see President Sisi, I do, he's done things that are not good, but he's also done lots of good things, and those are kind of God encounters. Yeah.
How about Bibles in Russia?
The what? Bibles in Russia. Yeah, that's a story. That was amazing. This is when I went on the trip with David Amos, and this was just before Gorbachev, or I think he'd probably just come to power, and no Bibles had been printed or imported into Russia since communism, so for many, many years. And we had a meeting with a guy called Konstantin Karchev, who was a member of the Politburo. And I don't know why we were not talking about Bibles or anything, but I suddenly said to him, "Look, would you could we bring in 1 million Bibles into Russia?" I just picked the number off the top of my head. We
Wow.
never deliver Bibles. We don't do anything like that. That's not CSW. And I don't know why I said it, but I was shocked by his response. And he immediately said, yes, of course you can.
Wow.
And kind of very long story short, we did manage, not ourselves, but through the Bible Society and others, we managed to deliver 1 million New Testaments. And it was the
Wow.
first time that the Bible had come in from outside for all those years. It was a total miracle. He was good to his word. And but a year or so later, he came back to this. He came to this country, and he asked to see me and David Atkinson, the MP, David Amis rather. And when I saw him, I thanked him for letting us deliver the Bibles. He said, "Would you like to send in another 1 million?" So I said, well, yes. I'm thinking, what's this all about? I said, yes, I would. Well, he says, but only if you promise to send in a whole Bible this time, not just half of it. So, so I said, yeah. I said, why? But what puzzles me, Mr. Karchev, is why you would want this. You're communists, you're atheists. Why would you suddenly want these Bibles to come in? He said, I'll tell you why. And he said something that I've never forgotten. He said this. He said, the Bible has been banned in Russia for years. He said, we've tried to close down the churches, but he said, the church just keeps on growing underground. They've not got any Bibles. He said, people have got scraps of paper where they've got verses written out from the Bible. And this was true in those days. People would type out on an old-fashioned typewriter with many carbon copies. They'd type out a page of the Bible. Bibles were so precious. And he said, but the church just keeps growing. He said, I can't stop it. He said, but when I come to your countries, when I come to America and to the UK, there's a Bible in every hotel room. He said, Bibles, there's so many versions of the Bible freely available. He said, but your churches are dying. So I want to kill our church in Russia. So that was his theory, that by making the Bible so widely available, that it wouldn't be precious anymore. That's an interesting thought, isn't it?
Yeah, very interesting. Dear. So wrong. How many Bibles have we got in our homes, people? Let's be reading them and let's be doing what the book says.
Absolutely.
Just CSW, they pretty much experts on North Korea in terms of human rights and advocacy, aren't they? You got a story about a new North Korean combat?
Yeah. I mean, North Korea is the worst place in the world without any shadow of doubt, and we've done a number of groundbreaking reports on North Korea. We were the first organisation that actually reported on human rights in North Korea way back in 2005. But yeah, I travelled to South Korea. I've never travelled into North Korea myself. There's not much point. But I travelled into South Korea, and because I believe that when North Korea eventually becomes free, and I do believe that one day it will become free, I believe when it does, we'll find Christians all over North Korea, even though it's illegal to be a Christian. And one of the reasons that I say that is this was a lady that I met in my hotel in Seoul in South Korea who had escaped from North Korea. And she came to meet me in my hotel for breakfast, and she brought with her an interpreter. She'd told me about her conversion. She had been a business lady, and she'd travelled far away from Pyongyang to a place where she was working. And when she was waiting to get the train home, an old lady came up to her on the train station and told her about the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, first of all, you need to understand that 99 people out of 100 would have turned that old lady in because she was propagating the Christianity. Everybody's a spy in North Korea, just much like they were in Romania when I first went. But this lady didn't turn her in. Instead, she listened and she accepted Jesus as her saviour there on that train station. As I say, then she eventually escaped. She pulled out of her bag a couple of exercise books, school exercise books, and they were written in pencil. I couldn't understand a word. It was all in North Korean. And she said to me, this is my journal of my Christian life. Now, And she'd already told me that she couldn't even tell her husband she'd become a Christian. She couldn't tell anybody. But how could she have a journal of a walk with Jesus, She'd got no Bible. She'd got no Christian books to read. She hadn't got a pastor. She hadn't got a radio station or a TV, gospel station to this. I thought, how could she have? I said to the guy that was with her, just read me some extracts from the book, will you? And he started to read, and he hadn't read it before, and he started to cry. And he said, this is absolutely incredible. He said, there is scripture quoted in here. Not chapter and verse, as it were, but literally words in there were words from the Bible. And he says she's talking about things like the grace of God. He said it's absolutely incredible. And I realized then that the Holy Spirit had been her pastor. The Holy Spirit had directly mentored her and brought her on in her faith. And I so truly believe that one day, when North Korea opens up, we'll find people like that all over North Korea. There will be a church in North Korea. I'm absolutely certain.
Amen. Well, Merv, listen, time's pretty much up. I just want to give you a parting shot, really, in terms of a blast of Merv, 72 years old, still going very strong. You're not putting your slippers on and coasting in self-indulgence from retirement to the grave. You're still life in the old dog yet. What's your parting shot to us?
Well, let me say, first of all, I've been on a journey since that first, when we were speaking up for Christians in Eastern Europe. We don't just speak up for Christians now, we speak up for people of all faiths. And this is really, really important to me. I think as Christians, there are 3 million Uyghur Muslims in China that are in re-education camps. You've got the Yazidis being slaughtered in Iraq. We, as Christians, we need to speak into that. And that's a journey that God's brought me on. I haven't had time to talk about that today, but it really is important that we speak up. And it's missional when we do that. When I speak up for a Uyghur Muslim in China, I'm doing that because I'm a Christian. And they say, why would you do that? And the answer is, well, because that's what Jesus would do. So that's been a journey. And but I would say to anybody listening that it's really, really important that we, particularly if you're involved in speaking up against injustice, speaking into issues of justice, and particularly in my field of religious freedom, this is a long-term thing. I can look back over 46 years and I can see, as I said right at the beginning when we talked about that all-party parliamentary group with over 150 members that came from 46 years ago. We've now got an International Religious Freedom and Belief Alliance of 44 countries that are meeting regularly, and I input into their council of experts. This is government levels, people who are talking about how we can change things. I look at the fact that we've got a Prime Minister's Special Envoy for freedom of religion or belief in this country and in many countries. But if you'd have asked me every year what I'd achieved in that year, I wouldn't have been able to necessarily tell you. I might have seen somebody like Father George Culture get out of prison. I might have seen other people that we've campaigned for freed. But what we really need to see is nobody being put into prison in the first place. But when I look back over the 46 years, I can see persecution is as bad as it's ever been. But I've got more hope than I've ever had, Simon, because I believe that there's more political awareness of what's going on in the world than there has ever been. And we need to move them out. When I tell people what I do, they often say to me, if they're not Christians, they'll often say to me, well, religion's the cause of all the problems in the world. They say that, and I understand why they say that, but they say out of a position of ignorance, the ignorance of the fact that most of the world, the majority by a long way, 85% of the world are religious. And we need to turn the narrative around from religion is the cause of all the problems in the world to freedom of religion or belief is one of the solutions to all the problems in the world, because religion impacts the way people live, who they marry, how they invest, all of those things. And we need to turn that around. But we need to not give up after a year or so, or not give up after a few weeks of working or something, particularly in the instant age where we get all the answers on our phone and we can communicate with people immediately. We need to work at it, and we need to recognize that this is God's work, and that we're speaking up for disadvantaged people, the kind of thing that Jesus did every day he was on this earth.
Yeah, excellent. And campaigning works, doesn't it? I remember taking 700 kids at New Eye, one of the groups, maybe it was Club One, and I said, I wrote, was it Open Doors? I wrote to them, we got a campaign going, and I said, look, guys, if 700 of us write a letter right now on Shi Weihan, or whatever the guy's name was, who's in prison in China for producing Bibles, in a year's time he'll be free, and I'll come back and tell you next year about him being free. And it was so cool to be able to do that. So campaigning works and advocacy works, but they're long, hard yards as well. And Merv,
yes.
I want to thank you for, as your book says, standing up and speaking out for 46 years and counting. I found that very inspiring, very challenging. Thanks for modelling it for me and the next generation. So God bless you, brother, and thanks for your time.
Thanks, Simon. Bless you too.
Brilliant. Hey, folks. Whew, good, isn't it? If you've been inspired, please gossip this podcast with your mates who would find it good to listen to, who might be inspired to adopt a similar sort of dogged career path. I don't know. The Lord speaks to us in different ways, doesn't he? Anyway, I'll be back next week with another fantastic guest, a very different story. I want to thank Adam Thomas Steer for the editing. He's just become a dad this week. I want to thank Mike Sandeman for the mixing. And we'll see you next time. Have a good week. God bless you, and toodaloo.